We could say ceremoniously when the Celtics took down the title, they also ended our pool. But if you listen to the last video, our pool is already taken down. But I thought, let's be ceremonial. Let's wait to the end. Let's do one more kind of wrap up video. I'm not going to do a big pomp and circumstance like I did for the football ones, for those who are in some of the football leagues. But I'm going to change the template a little bit. I'll do kind of my awards, given the guise of the awards that we tend to get points for. Then I'll get to our league and then, a couple wrap up notes. So, apologies if the voice is a bit off. I've been a bit sick since coming back from Kenya. You might be able to hear it. Maybe not. Who knows? Either way, let's get rolling. So I did try and make these kind of yearly, but there's going to be some recency bias more than likely, especially with the playoffs just finishing. And actually, it feels like the playoffs have been on for so long that it's almost the same time as the league or over the same time span. I know that's not necessarily the case. I'm also starting with the awards that maybe aren't the most vital and the ones I don't actually really fully understand. So our Hustle Award, in this particular case, I just went that players obviously hustled too much or not enough. Injuries were a huge component, and I know you can say that about just about any year, but especially if you look in the East, every team seemed to be dropping like flies. I mean, the Knicks battled hard, even though they had constant injury woes, and Randall being someone that was out for an extended period of time. But I mentioned in previous videos during the playoff run, they were never really fully healthy. But I think in our pool, what impacted us the most, we did have some players go down, Embiid being probably the one with the most kind of impact, and Chainer will tell you that that was a massive impact. He also kind of came back and had a huge impact on this playoff run. I mean, just looking at the numbers, I was reading that only 6 players that made up playoff team within like the playoff team realms, only 6 players total played all 82 of their team's games. Now, some of that is load management, as we know, but Embiid, Chainer can tell you, not the case. And then when he came back, not only was he actually an MVP candidate for part of the year, during the playoffs, he really could only play about 25 to 30 minutes well, and then it just kind of went downhill. It's actually why the Philly and Knicks series was so great. It's because it was so erratic, and you just total chaos. Their benches were so minimal that you really didn't know what you were going to get, but first half would be totally different from the second half, and Embiid was a huge case of that. He probably only should have really played one half at a time. It also kind of made the East feel like the JV league, like I mentioned before, but obviously the Celtics fans would have an issue with that, and we'll get to them in a little bit. Another like kind of side point, Embiid now is still the only former MVP winner who's never gotten past the second round of the playoffs in their career. So interesting side note for next year. But I lucked out that Giannis had enough games to get the awards, but we know in the playoffs, no Giannis, tons of cry. And even someone like Halliburton, his whole season was changed. Now, he did luck in there, and he did get some points. He did get some mentions, and he qualified. But he probably shouldn't have, right? We knew this year that one of the big factors and one of the rule changes was the minimum amount of games you had to play didn't leave for a lot. And I think that's something that if we keep up with the rules in the future, it might impact who we end up picking and who we end up kind of running with. So that's our Hustle Award. If I don't understand hustle, I understand clutch way less. I know what clutch is, but I don't know how you measure it. I don't know there's stats to figure it out. But for me, I thought, what are some clutch measurements? And for this one, there was recency bias because I was looking at the 2 teams that made it to the end. And one of the things that they both did was some maneuvering, whether it was at the trade deadline or before the season. I think Gafford and Washington were pretty critical pickups for the Mavs. But let's be honest, this whole idea and the thing that I think shapes how this entire season ends up going is, how do the Celtics get Drew Holiday? And then almost like seemingly at the same time, the double positive for them, they get the Bucks to get worse by getting Dame Lillard. I think if you actually watched any of the finals games, Rennie, you know this, you sat next to me for 3 of them. I get that it's a basketball and you give it to one of your top guys, so it was going to be Tatum or Brown. I think Drew Holiday had the biggest impact on the finals. He would have been my most actual valuable player just because when they needed points, he got them. He didn't have 5 great games, but none of them really did. Brown did probably have the most consistent of the finals runs. But what he does for you matchup-wise, the amount of times, like he's just a game changer. He creates matchup advantages because he can lock people down and he can guard people from pretty much every position. So you don't have this win in my mind if Holiday's not a Celtic. And so some of the deals that were able to kind of to fall their way, and obviously injuries fall their way. But yeah, if I'm saying clutch, apparently being an active GM helps. The sixth man's a little bit more interesting here because it's usually someone coming off the bench. For this, I went for people who used to come off the bench, or no, wait, they used to sit on a bench. Now they are on a bench. This is the TV coverage and the search for stories. I thought this was an interesting byproduct all year long. And I know this isn't brand new, but it is really funny now with more alternative media sources and with players having their own podcasts. And it's really changing how TV coverage goes. And realistically, during the season, there was enough stuff to kind of cover, but you saw this in the postseason. They were running out of stories, so they started creating their own. Now, we have to assume every year we fall under this, that not everyone in the media, not every individual fan can follow each team. That's why, like this year, like in any other year, all of a sudden they're like, oh, Jokic, Luka, Giannis, they're amazing. Because when they see them in the playoffs, they understand why there's that so much hype, because they're not necessarily following those markets. Now, sometimes you actually see announcers getting caught into this, but that's a whole other story. But this year we saw ESPN, TNT, they're kind of pulling back the curtain and who they're hiring and who they're firing and the contract deals. And if you're not aware, the NBA is looking to change who's covering what and splicing it up like a lot of people are. They're following the NFL model, or at least it looks like they're trying to get some streamers interested, so for some premium games, etc. And during this time, things are a little bit bumpy. I mean, look at ESPN. They hire Pat McAfee, who's done nothing but create controversy. So you think in ESPN's history, normally that means some limited time, limited exposure. Complete opposite. Even after he, calls Caitlin Clark what he called her, and even though it was supposed to be that compliment, I mentioned that before, that would be enough for anyone in the history of ESPN to get fired. Instead, they kind of need it, because I think part of the problem is they don't need it, but there isn't enough stories for the amount of coverage that they have, and they've realized maybe you can start covering your coverage. So they're getting a little bit meta here. Even Stephen A., you see him walking in now as if he's a player. He's not. He's a personality, and he's replaceable. And I know players can be too, but realistically, it's them making their own hype machine because they don't have anything else to talk about. So if they can talk about their people, maybe it's a bit better. So I don't think this is going to calm down. I think the shock jock style is going to come back a little bit if you've lived long enough, and we all have, fortunately. We've seen these trends go in and out, and so this is just kind of currently in fashion. But even at the end, there was nothing to talk about in the finals. They came in. You knew the Celtics were going to win. It's just a matter of how many games. So they started picking and seeing, it's Tatum versus Brown. There has not been one piece of evidence to ever suggest that, but they're picking and they're going at scabs and they're just trying to figure out what they can figure out. So it's not that surprising. And I'm saving some of this when we talk about the Celtics in a little bit, but not only did they have to kind of manipulate some stories, but they were talking about themselves. We know more about like Barkley and he's potentially retiring after next year. I think that's BS, but whatever. The desk is going to change at TNT, and who gets that? Realistically, that shouldn't be what you're covering during the NBA Finals. You should be covering the actual NBA Finals, but maybe we'll get to another reason behind that in a little bit. But that is my sixth man award. MIP for who took the biggest leap. Now, the argument could be there for Luka, definitely. Just like, spoiler alert, he doesn't win my MVP either, but he could be a candidate there as well. I think taking that leap on the main platform is very helpful. I think people know more about his background than they used to, but he started off pretty high. I mean, he's been all NBA forever, so that's not really like a big jump. When I think of most improved, I'm thinking of someone who's jumped from someone who potentially could be great to now all of a sudden getting compared to some of the greats and handling it both on and off the court pretty well. So not surprising, I'm going with Ant-Man on this one because not only did he overachieve, they knock out the defending champions. He's getting compared to the greatest in the game for his work ethic and what he's able to do on the court. And then he gives a great answer at the end when they talk about him falling in the next round and just saying, I need to be in better shape. We need to be in better shape. We were fully equipped to go off for a couple rounds, but then we failed. And I'm young and I'm ready to roll. I'm very interested to see how this gives fuel in the positive and potentially in the negative going into the Olympics, because he's on the U.S. team. They didn't pick the team based on a team, and it looks like maybe some people are going to be bowing out, so maybe they can fill in those gaps. It looks like they're really trying to do the dream team thing and give LeBron and Curry and Durant a send-off, but they haven't always shown the ability to coexist and who plays hard defense and who does the things in between. If Ant-Man is one of those pieces that they bring in and can kind of do everything and get that international attention, this would be interesting to see if he springs even higher and is even more improved, but that's part of the reason why also I gave him the award this year. Before we get into Rookie of the Year, Defensive of the Year, and MVP, we also have always done kind of the all-NBA, all-defensive, the full team. So I'm not going to do one for each, but I am going to do just a 5 listing and not ramble as much about each one, but just 5 kind of stories that I thought were kind of cool and notes that I'd written down every week and every month. I jot down some stuff. So these are some things that came up, or some one point that came up a lot. Number 1, coaching changes. Crazy. KD blames Vogel and he's out. How many more times can he blame a coach? Let's see. JJ, I'll go in a little bit more detail in a second about that one, but not too much. Him going in and Hurley saying no to the Lakers. Nobody says no to the Lakers, and now they're taking. Now, I will say one thing, though. People who are like, whoa, now the channel's open for a podcaster to go straight to coaching. JJ is not. He is a podcaster. He's a media personality, but he's also an ex-player, and there is a well-documented history of ex-players becoming coaches. We know he's cerebral. How he's going to do with Braun, and let's be honest, probably Bronny too. Only time will tell. Number 2, more of a stat here. With Al Horford winning his first ever title, James Harden is now the active player with the most number of playoff games played without a title. Carry that in your hat for next year. 3 is another stat one. Looking up, and I looked up some stats here, this 20-20-10 line that you can achieve in a game, and even average amongst a few games, but it's the games that you clear the bar. There's only 7 people in the world, I believe, that has done it. I've got a little stat to help me out. And he's one of the only 2 players who have done it more than once, and they've both done it 4 times. Just evidence again in case you needed it. The Joker's awesome. Number 4, this is one I talked about a lot, so I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail. I think if we're going to make a sitcom title, Everybody Hates Rudy would probably be a good one for this year. And Draymond, I'm going to be really interested to see how this kind of goes down, because those bridges are definitely burnt. There's people on both sides, and there's people that just hate both of them for what they're doing to the game. I mean, Rudy just for being a little bit overhyped, and Draymond for, beating the crap out of people, being essentially a bully in a very anti-bully culture, and him actually getting signed on and getting more deals from the aforementioned ESPN, who clearly is looking for the ratings bump. So that'll be an interesting one. And number 5, the changing of the guards, just between kind of the teams that made the leap. Now, if you go back, and we will in a second, because I'm going to go over quickly just our teams that we picked when I get to our pool wrap up. If you look at the teams that were like supposed to do a bit better, like, the Thunder and the Timberwolves, they jumped up way further than I think most people anticipated. But this creates a whole dynamic in the league that we weren't really ready for. I think next year might be a little more status quo to this year. But just thinking about this, if you include the teams that just straight up didn't make the playoffs, the play-in losers, so the ones who made one of the play-in rounds but didn't actually make the top 8, and then teams who lost in the first round, I'm going to list the players that did not exist after the first round in our playoff run. We got Giannis, Embiid, Butler, Fox, George, Kawhi, Harden, KD, Booker, Zion, Ja, Davis, Curry, and LeBron. This also leaves like a bunch of mid-range guys, because most of those guys, you can make an argument that some of those maybe aren't the top of top tiers, but they're all legit. They're all all-stars. They're all people that we picked, and they were gonzo. So going into next year, I'm wondering how this is kind of going to shape up. Is this going to translate into some of the awards? Are we going to see some of this clash in the Olympics already? Exciting times. For our Rookie of the Year, I kind of interpreted this loosely, because I was thinking about just having this be a way of me talking about Wemby again, because I do still think he should have been Defensive Player of the Year. I know it's a whole season thing, but he just changes the way that people play defense, and I think that is more indicative. Whatever. But that's not the winner, because I did a Rookie of the Year / breakout, so something new to us. And I'm kicking it back to a few of the points I was making during the NCAA wrap-ups, which you are all in that pool, and so perhaps you watched those videos. But it's the WNBA if you look at it. And if you look at just so far games this year and televised audiences, now this is before, I should say I'm recording this on June 23rd. The stat that I had was, I think, just prior to the previous Reese and Caitlin game. But there's another one tonight. We'll see if that maybe cracks it. Because it's it's undeniable that this has been a huge cultural impact, even to the point, Kate Money Martin, who's a seldom, she played 10 minutes for the Aces, which is great for her. She wasn't supposed to be drafted. She's in like the top 12 in All-Star voting right now, which means she won't get a starting role, but that's pretty insane. It's because people are jumping in because the college kind of momentum has carried through, and I think people just around that vicinity have jumped up forward. And so this has raised a lot of kind of fun parts and some frustrating ones, right? I mean, you can tell a lot of people haven't watched women's sports before at a high level because we're shocked, apparently, as a culture that women can be physical, that they can trash talk, that there's a different side of women's athletics that maybe you weren't privy to, but also a difference in representation, how things are covered, some major personalities that are making major mistakes and getting called on it. It's actually been a mix of frustrating and hilarious, but I think it's bumps that need to happen, and I think it's in the better general direction. I don't know about your feeds online, and I know it's very algorithmic based, and I've always, I've coached a lot of women's sports, so I've followed a lot of female reporters in the past, so my feed has always been a little bit more of WNBA than I think a lot of people, but now it's blowing up, and certainly during the past couple weeks, you wouldn't even have known if you just looked at my feed that this was the NBA Finals, but you definitely knew about most upcoming matchups in the WNBA. So an interesting kind of notice for this year and a breakout story. I thought that merited an award. I think you might find that last award, this award, and next award have some common themes to them, but especially this one and the next one. So we have defensive player and MVP left. For defensive, I didn't go as in defensive, but defensive, and I'm giving that to the Celtics fans. Again, I know it depends who you read and who you look at, but all of a sudden this, why do people doubting us? Why aren't people watching this? And, like I said, I think it's finals games were actually being outwatched by, Sky versus Fever games and a non-elimination playoff game. But I don't think that's necessarily the Celtics' fault, but the Boston stuff gets a little bit bitter. Now, some of you know I do follow some people who are Boston sports favorites. I'm not just talking about them, but I'm also talking about them. There's this little bit saying, should we really count Lakers titles from when they were in Minnesota? Now, I actually think that's a decent argument. They aren't the same franchise, and you don't necessarily count. Like, I don't think the Thunder say that they're, they count the old Celtics and like the 70s championships. But I would say if you're going to open up that door, Boston, you got to be careful, because personally for me, I understand that they all count, but I would question the number of 60s titles. I mean, if you look at the kind of the history of the league, I mean, in 46, 47, there was 11 teams, but by the next year, they were down to 8 and went up to 17 a couple years later. Then it was back down to 8 or 9. For more than half of the 1960s, when the Celtics had a massive run, there was only 8 or 9 teams. It wasn't until about 1970 that it got to about 17 again, and then it's been grown ever since. You could also make the argument in 79 when they came up with the three-point line that changes the nature of the game. But if we want to say, I'm Canadian. If I don't mention hockey at least once out of every 25 sentences, I'm in question to, lose my passport. But it's the same with like original six titles. I don't like to get in a lot of conversations with Leaf fans. They're very defensive, but they won in 67, I believe. And I think the last time they won, it was still the original six. Do you really celebrate all of these titles? Like, are the Canadians the most successful franchise of all time? Not really. They haven't won in like 30 years, right? So but this idea that we count these titles when there was like no resources, only a couple cities really cared, and there was only a couple teams, I think that could be an argument too. So Boston just has this weird thing though, where and Rennie, I'm fully aware you're a Boston fan, but you're not a bad Boston fan. I think you just like to support your teams. But this concept that Boston cares so much about these titles and dynasties, there was that line in the White Stripes song, you can't be a pimp and a prostitute too. Boston likes to sell itself as the lovable underdogs, and they're like, they play on the Red Sox lore of all that losing, and they're like, we're not the Yankees, we're not the... But then at the same time, you're like, well, the Patriots were a dynasty, Boston, greatest team of all time, most championships. You can't be both. And honestly, in our lifetime, there hasn't been more than 4 or 5 years go by without a Boston team winning a major title. you're not the small town victim anymore. You are the Yankees. You are the Empire. And that's why people don't like you, because the same reason you didn't like the Yankees. So you can't be mad that only you care about your little victories and whatnot, and everyone else is fine. If you like the players, it's fine. But let's be honest again, it's not your fault that Denver didn't make it through in the West. I think that final would have been watched a little bit more, but everyone just kind of assumed you were going to dummy the Mavs, which is why JJ, as I mentioned before, and Kendrick were bigger stories the week that you won it than you. And even though you won by 18 your last game, I think we can all agree Drake took a bigger beating than the Mavs did this week, or Celtics when you lost by almost 40. So you can't have it both ways. If you want to count all titles, count all titles. If you want to start getting picky, just be careful. But again, that's more defensive player of the year. Relax, Rennie. It's not anti-Celtics. You're winning the MVP too. But I would say more specifically, Brad Stevens, Joey Maz, and the two Jasons probably get your MVP. Just this idea of dancing with Houbranga, making some of the trades like I mentioned. But, Brown and Tatum play together. They made the commitment for Brown in the offseason. Stevens is showing himself to be one of the best GMs. I think, a lot of people had problems with Mazzulla and not really sure. I still don't think he's phenomenal, but he's quirky enough to make this work. I still don't love all of his lineups, but the reality is he had the best team. He stayed out of its way. If KP would have played the whole season and the whole playoffs, which I understand never happens, I think they blow out the East. I think it'll be interesting next year. Do they carry this momentum and this confidence? But I think the MVP, just dancing with Houbranga, staying home, keeping your nucleus the same and building around it. I think that's kind of the most important story of the year. I went over this last time, not going to spend a lot of time, if any, here. Just I thought after some of the conversations of some of the players who came in, I took it by a point over Rennie, and then Horst and Chainer tied, and it was obviously Shea that kind of struggled a bit here. But if you look round by round, I got the first pick in this one, so obviously I picked poorly because two people in that round, both Luka and Jokic, outscored them. Jokic being obviously the pick of the year and the pick of the round. If you go to the second round, I did think I got a steal in SGA by the end of it. Now Davis obviously stepped up too, and it's not like Tatum was a slouch. Actually, in collectively, this was probably one of our best rounds, because in our first round probably would have been better, but Curry didn't really do as much as I think Shea, or even I, if you look at my team picks, were hoping for, and Embiid not making the minimum amount of games and getting hurt. Sucked for Chainer. But our second round, that was a little bit better. But again, Shea, you were on the weaker side of that. And this is where LeBron didn't pay off as much for Horst as he would have liked, because the rest of us got 6 or above. Third round, I think I stole it with Wemby. But again, here's where I see, so we have a little more variance. By the fourth round, stole it with Halliburton, only one to get points, and then I didn't get any more points after that. I think Bam was a steal, Fox ends up being a steal, Sabonis probably the steal, and then Maxey being, Sabonis and then Gobert was probably the steal, since he was one of the top guys near the very end. Props to Rennie in the seventh round for having the only one who scored any points, and then props to Rennie and Chainer for the only ones in their pickup round to actually get any points. So well done there. In terms of the team picks, so this is where I think Chainer, again, you had horrible luck this year, because when you get the first pick in teams, that means you get the last pick. So not your fault that you get the Pistons, but you did end up with them. But again, I think we talked about this last time. Rennie just having 5 out of 6 was pretty dominant. I had 5 out of 6 with points, but not the best kind of points. Although kind of funny, I did get the second best choice here. This is kind of rare, because the Mavs didn't do a whole lot in the in-season tournament, where Pacers went far and had a success in the in-season tournament. So that was my kind of best luck. But if you look round by round, as I was mentioning, Rennie obviously wins this round. I think me and my Lakers pick wins the second round. Mavericks, clear win here, although Thunder did pretty well for themselves, and it could have been even better. Rennie definitely wins. I and Rennie win this round. Mine more in season, his more, I guess they got to about the same distance though, didn't they? So there you go. And then Rennie obviously wins this one, where I got the Bulls were a point, but he got the Magic. Everyone else got shut down. And then we'll say Shea, Rennie, and I all won the third one, because we didn't get the negatives. Chainer, not necessarily your fault on that. So if we look, I won the player round by 1, and I finished second. So you think it would be close, but I think we can see this 32 was pretty monstrous by Rennie to have both the finalist and the champion. Not much we're going to do. When you pop a 60, it is likely our highest score, because like I said, this year there was just more points to get. me off by 13. We've definitely had closer runs than that. But this cements it. This is the third year in a row, 3 out of 3 that the number 3 spot gets it. So maybe we'll know the result of the pool next year just when we do the horse race at the beginning. Let's see what happens. But I also think there's going to be more ways to maneuver. And if you look at the wasted amount of players that we had, some players that got points that weren't even on our as an option, we'll get better the more we do this, right? That's how it works. You just somehow get better at things just if you try them more. Yeah, sure. Why not? Anyway, congrats, Rennie. My only real regret, for those who didn't know, I was in Kenya last week for a wedding, not mine or Rennie's. He's already done that. I probably never will. So, but I stayed at Rennie's place, and the last day, about a week ago today, actually, I did physically give him his winnings after we watched 3 of the games together. I knew beforehand already. I just didn't want to jinx it. So in retrospect, I should have taken a picture of us shaking hands and exchanging the cash, because that very rarely happens in a pool like this. But congrats again, Rennie. Spend our money wisely. I'm not doing my 2 cents. You've heard enough of my voice. We are going to wrap it up here, but a quick thanks to everyone if you've been watching these. Obviously, I like making them. I hope I have some time next year to keep up with my videos, but in about a month's time, I have a job again, so we'll see how that works. But this pool has always been kind of perfect for me in terms of a little bit of commitment at a couple times throughout the year, and then you get to follow the NBA and have a little more of a vested interest. Now, we do have some rule proposals that I'm going to be throwing out. I could do it now, or we could do it a little bit later. I'll probably wait till later just out of, the fact that some of us are on summer. The ones that I think are kind of no-brainers, the idea of, I think we've already agreed that ranking the teams is just the way it's going to go, so we won't have any tie for positions anymore. We never really solved the tie for a statistical category. I just kind of said my piece, Rennie said his, so I'll probably ask for people to vote on that at some point between now and the start of the season. Shay had mentioned a couple cool ideas. I think one that seemed that no one was upset with was giving points for the team's coach who wins Coach of the Year to go towards our team points. I'm cool with that, but I'll put that out to a vote. Shay also asked for a few more players. I think that's cool. Rennie, I know you've always been trying to figure out if it's even between the teams and the players. But again, I kind of need, if there's some ideas that people have to increase points in one or the other. I think that obviously this year we had a massive jump in the team points because of the in-season tournament. So if we want to keep that the same. Anyway, I'll come up with a little bit of a survey and realistically try and get in touch before the end of October, so maybe the beginning of October. We probably have to start a little bit earlier next year just because I'm going to be in a different time zone. We've always had at least a certain amount of time that we're all awake at the same time. That window will be slightly smaller next year, but all of that is stuff to say. So just when I get in touch in early October or even potentially earlier, just send a note, we'll vote. But in the meantime, thanks if you've been watching most, if not all of these. Thanks for being involved in the league. It's been a lot of fun, and I'll see you next year. Well, let's be honest. I'll see you before next year, but you know what I mean.